Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. In international politics, apologies are easy. Accountability is not. And the difference between the two is often where relationships quietly break down. Russia and Azerbaijan are discovering that gap the hard way. What looked like a post-crisis reset after a deadly plane crash is now giving way to contradictory narratives, legal backtracking, and diplomatic distance, leaving bilateral ties suspended between normalization and renewed mistrust. Let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
More than a year after the downing of an Azerbaijani civilian airliner, the incident continues to strain relations between Baku and Moscow. Russia's recent decision to drop its criminal investigation into the crash has revived tensions and raised new questions on accountability. The aircraft was shot down in December 2024 as it prepared to land in Russia's Chechnya region. According to Azerbaijani officials, Russian air defense systems mistakenly struck the plane with shrapnel. Despite severe damage, the jet managed to cross the Caspian Sea before crashing near Aktau, Kazakhstan. 38 of the 67 people on board were killed. Azerbaijan quickly demanded a full investigation and clear responsibility. Russia initially avoided admitting fault, prompting months of sharp diplomatic exchanges. Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev accused Moscow of arrogance and disrespect towards Azerbaijan's sovereignty. In October 2025, Vladimir Putin publicly acknowledged that Russian air defenses had shot down the plane. He promised compensation for victims' families and said that actions of responsible officials would be legally assessed. Russia also opened a criminal investigation. That process has now ended without charges. Azerbaijani officials say that they were notified late last year that Russia's investigative committee had closed the case. Moreover, Azerbaijani officials have noted that compensation payments remain incomplete. Despite Moscow repeating its intention to follow through, no timeline has been provided for the victims' compensation. For Azerbaijan, the issue remains unresolved. Responsibility has been acknowledged, but accountability remains absent.
And now, let's zone in on the east-planning portion of our show. Over the past decade, relations between Azerbaijan and Russia have moved from careful balance to open strain. What once looked like a stable partnership is now under pressure from shifting realities of power and unresolved crisis. As always, here's a closer look.
Between 2016 and 2018, Baku treated Moscow as a key regional security broker, especially after the brief fighting in April 2016 with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh. Russia supplied weapons and maintained influence, while Azerbaijan avoided joining Moscow-led blocs such as the Collective Security Treaty Organization. From 2019 to mid-2020, the relationship settled into a pre-war status quo. Russia preserved leverage through the unresolved Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and arms sales to both sides. The 44-day war in late 2020 changed the balance. Azerbaijan regained large territories with Turkish support, while Russia brokered the ceasefire and deployed peacekeepers. This formalized Moscow's security role, but also increased Baku's confidence. In February 2022, President Ilham Aliyev and Vladimir Putin signed a declaration on allied interaction. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine soon weakened its regional leverage. By 2023, that erosion was clear. During Azerbaijan's Rapid Karabakh operation, Russian peacekeepers did not intervene. Their passivity signaled Moscow's reduced ability or willingness to constrain Baku. In 2024, quiet friction turned into open crisis after an Azerbaijani plane crash was blamed on an accidental Russian shootdown. The episode exposed the limits of the so-called alliance. What remains is not a partnership of equals, but a relationship under sustained stress.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Russia-Azerbaijan relations are not collapsing, they're doing something arguably more dangerous, drifting into a state of unresolved ambiguity. No open rupture, no clear reconciliation, just a widening gap between political gestures and institutional reality. The events surrounding President Ilham Aliyev's sudden decision not to attend late December CIS and Euro-Asian Economic Council meetings make that limbo impossible to ignore. Formally, Baku's explanation was procedural and polite. Azerbaijan is not a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, and the president has a busy schedule. Informally, though, the message was unmistakable. Only a day earlier, the Kremlin had publicly anticipated Aliyev's attendance and even floated the possibility of a bilateral meeting with Vladimir Putin. The reversal was not just a scheduling correction, it was a signal that something remained fundamentally unresolved. That something is the crash of an Azerbaijan Airlines aircraft near Grozny in December 2024 and the long, uneven aftermath that followed. For months, the incident poisoned bilateral relations, raising uncomfortable questions about Russian air defense practices and accountability. The October 2025 meeting between Putin and Aliyev in Dushanbe was widely interpreted as a turning point. Putin's apology, his acknowledgement of air defense involvement, and his promise of compensation and legal assessment created an impression that Moscow was prepared, at least politically, to close the chapter. But politics only matters if institutions follow. And that is where the relationship begins to fray again. When Azerbaijan's foreign minister confirmed that Moscow had quietly terminated the criminal investigation into the crash, the reaction in Baku was not muted disappointment but open disbelief. The decision directly contradicted what had been promised at the highest level. More damaging still was the explanation that later surfaced through a leaked letter from Russia's investigative committee. Gone were Ukrainian drones, air defense malfunctions, missile detonations, and shrapnel damage. In their place appeared weather conditions, failed landing attempts, and pilot error. This was not a technical disagreement. This was a collision of narratives. Putin's account in Dushanbe described an external state-level failure with legal and political consequences. The prosecution's letter described an unfortunate aviation accident devoid of institutional responsibility. Both cannot be true at the same time, and the coexistence of these explanations has become the core problem in Russian-Azerbaijan relations. From Baku's perspective, this discrepancy cuts deeper than the crash itself. Azerbaijan is not questioning Russia's capacity to make mistakes, it is questioning Russia's willingness to own them. For a country that has spent the past decades carefully balancing relations with Moscow, Ankara, and the West, credibility matters. An apology followed by a legal retreat reads not as reconciliation, but as damage control. Until Moscow reconciles its words with its institutions, Russia-Azerbaijan relations will remain suspended, functional on the surface, brittle underneath, and increasingly vulnerable to the next crisis that demands more than an apology. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Rusif Husinov, director of the Topchubashov Center. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So we know that whenever relationship goes sour, usually both parties would prefer things to be a little bit more clear instead of passive aggressiveness or some silent treatment. But that seems to be what is happening between Moscow and Azerbaijan. Can you help us break down a little bit of how the relationship came to be that way and what are some of the things that's not really being spoken?
Yeah, the current deterioration of the relations between Baku and Moscow is a direct result of the Azerbaijani aircraft downed by the Russians back in December 2024. Over a year has passed and the Azerbaijani side had been demanding over this entire period of time the public acknowledgement of the wrongdoing by the Russian side, an official apology, and the compensation, of course. So far, the Russian officials have not been actually assumed any responsibility, although some month ago, back in fall, during his conversation with President of Azerbaijan Ilham Aliyev, Russian leader Vladimir Putin, kind of acknowledged the Russian involvement in this process, but it was kind of what I call a Schrödingerian apology. It was an apology which was not an apology formally. And most recently, just a couple of weeks ago, a letter signed by the Russian uh, prosecutor general went viral and created another wave of outrage in Azerbaijan because, according to that statement, the aircraft had a crash because of technical errors, and like allegedly there was no Russian involvement. Of course, this could not satisfy the Azerbaijani side, which is keeping its firm ground, which still retains its demands from the Russian side. But so far, we are still seeing that this entire situation is hanging in limbo.
All right, like you mentioned, there was a sort of a apology, non-apology issued from the Russian side to Azerbaijan, but it's also one of those apologies that sounded like, well, I'm very sorry that you feel that way. Do you think that would actually anger the Azerbaijani side, seeing that they're trying to, well, try to smooth things over without really kind of doing anything substantial?
Well, on the one hand, we are observing here a kind of Russian tradition of downing civilian aircraft and then not assuming any responsibility. I can refer to several very well-known examples of the Korean airplane, which was shot down by the Soviets back in the 1980s, and then Malaysian Airlines aircraft back in 2014. And a similar pattern is being observed here as well. So there is no surprise, actually. On the other hand, the Azerbaijani side could actually break this pattern a little bit when the Russian officials finally made a semi-apology. First, Putin acknowledged that the incident happened in the Russian airspace. It was early 2025, and then in fall, as I said earlier, the Russian leader referred to the involvement of the Russian air defense system, but they were far from the public and official acknowledgement. So, yes, you are right, and we're still waiting.
Right. Now, of course, this plane crash situation is more of a flashpoint in time. However, if we look back about a decade or so, can you help us map out how Moscow is being perceived within Azerbaijan for the past couple of years?
Well, the day when this interview is being recorded is January 20th, and it's an important date for the contemporary Azerbaijani history because on this day in 1990, the Soviet Russian tanks rolled over into Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, where I'm sitting at right now, and killed hundreds of innocent civilians. And that trauma is still with us and is still shaping the public sentiments in Azerbaijan towards the Russian state. However, the leadership in Azerbaijan cannot, of course, ignore the mere fact that Russia is our neighbor, and always try to somehow keep a careful balancing approach towards Russia. On the one hand, it never joined any anti-Russian blocs or coalitions or sanctions. On the other hand, it always avoided Russian projects, Eurasian structures, etc. So this was a careful balancing by the Azerbaijani state. But if you ask about the societal perception, it's always negative. And since the invasion of Ukraine started, the public sentiments towards Russia became even more negative because here in this context we clearly, I mean the Azerbaijanis, we clearly associate ourselves with the Ukrainians.
All right, I'm looking at the geopolitics. We do see major powers also trying to get Azerbaijan to align with them as well. But like you mentioned before, with Azerbaijan's geography being so close to Moscow, do you think that it is possible, sustainable, or even practical for Azerbaijan to be any other organizations that would run directly against Russia?
It's a very interesting question, actually, because South Caucasus, just like the other parts of the wider post-Soviet region, was for years, if not decades, driven by a simple dichotomy, West or Russia. So for many countries living in Eurasia or this buffer zone, they had this dilemma. We either join pro-Western projects or the pro-Russian camp. However, the Azerbaijani side broke this dilemma also by investing in a third or alternative geopolitical pole, which is the Turkic integrations project. And together with Turkey and several Central Asian countries, Azerbaijan has been working in raising this organization of Turkic states. For us, it's a safer haven. We want to stay outside of this West-Russia geopolitical confrontation, but at the same time, we want some sort of geopolitical pole in order to have our anchor at. So, in our case, it's a third scenario.
Right. Speaking of geopolitics and on Moscow, do you think that with increased international isolation and the Kremlin can't really afford to lose any more allies, they would try to soften their stance and try to court Azerbaijan a little bit once again?
It's very tricky. On the one hand, yes, at some point we feel that the Russian authorities, they try to court Azerbaijan, in some cases Central Asian states or Armenia or whoever lie in their proximity. On the other hand, by following the carrots and sticks policy, they try to also utilize a more assertive policy. And it's also very obvious. And I think, depending on how the war in Ukraine progresses, and depending on a possible Putin-Trump deal, we'll see how the Russians redesign their relevant policy on wider Eurasia. I'm afraid that any scenario which would imply a Yalta 2.0 would definitely embolden the Russian appetite in this part of the world.
Right. And going back to our original topic about the limbo of diplomatic relations between the two countries, do you think it'll eventually be more cleared out, or is it more advantageous for Russia, for example, to keep things vague and in this kind of limbo situation? I
believe the current state of affairs is not in the Russian interests because the Azerbaijani side also refused to attend the most recent CIS summit hosted in Russia, and it was also a reputational damage to the hosts. Plus, they also need Azerbaijan in terms of connectivity, in terms of new routes to the global south, including Iran, Turkey, and the Gulf region. Therefore, they would definitely be interested in somehow mending these relations by either courting Azerbaijan or actually by pressuring also. This is another possibility. Why not? And they have certain tools of leverage they would like to use against Baku.
All right, so we'll have to see whether they try to do it the easy way, the hard way. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
My pleasure.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash. a series of all the other stories from the East I don't want to miss. Russia has significantly expanded its use of the sea's port in Mariupol, portraying illegal appropriation as reconstruction, while the city's remaining residents face deepening hardship.
Ukrainian intelligence says Moscow is transforming Mariupol into a key logistics hub, linking occupied eastern Ukraine with Crimea and mainland Russia, replacing Ukrainian standards with Russian ones to create a facade of legality and bypass sanctions. At the same time, civilian life is collapsing. Housing confiscations have accelerated, and displaced residents are still waiting for compensation promised after the 2022 siege. Officials say Russia is investing in infrastructure while severely neglecting the civilian population.
Russia's state internet regulator dramatically expanded online censorship last year, blocking roughly 1.29 million web pages, a 59% increase compared with 2024.
The sharpest rise involved content linked to tools for bypassing restrictions, such as VPN services, which surged more than 12-fold. Authorities have also significantly increased blocking of material related to LGBTQ topics, alcohol sales, drugs, and content deemed to be harmful to minors. The regulator attributed the rise partly to stricter legal definitions that now classify previously ambiguous material as illegal, particularly for children. Officials also pointed to the wider use of automated monitoring tools, including advanced text analysis, image recognition, and predictive analytics, across major social media platforms.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.